And at the same time, we are the most murderous animals on the planet. From the moment that we began to walk upright on our two legs, which I basically think was a fantastic. I'm going to try the old medieval technology of just a handheld microphone. I was just saying we are such a strange species because we are so violent on the one hand and we are so loving on the other hand. And since we began to walk on our two legs 1.8 million years ago, we have been xenophobic. We never really liked the other tribes. We deeply distrusted other tribes. And as a result of our deep distrust, we usually killed them. We have been genocidal since 1.8 million years. And the real puzzling question is, how can there be so much contradictions? Oh, that sounds very nice. I think the Lord himself speaks to me. He says, be careful with what you're going to say. Well, whatever, my dear Lord, I'm going to say it anyway. We are, as human species, we are the strange combination of two great apes. We have 98% of the DNA in common with one great ape, which is called the chimpanzee, and another great ape, which is called the bonobo. And chimpanzees are tremendously intelligent, but also very awkward, very unpleasant animals, very violent. They plot and plan. They really like devious politicians. And they kill each other, and they kill other monkeys. They're just like human beings. But then also we have the DNA of this other monkey, the bonobo, which is the hippie monkey. And whereas the chimpanzees solve all the problems in the community with violence, the bonobos solve all the problems by just making love. Isn't that wonderful? I know if there is something like, you come back after life, then I would like to come back as a bonobo. The real nice animal. So we have the dimensions of these two animals in us. We are both chimpanzees and bonobos. We are both extremely aggressive and extremely loving. But the problem seems to me that in the course of history, the chimpanzees usually prevail. And we have to try to find, and I hope we can do that today. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we can find today a solution to this question? Why is it that the chimpanzees always prevail? I think it has to do with the peculiar phenomenon of our species. We go not only through a biological evolution, in which our genes are the defining features, those self-replicating entities that imitate themselves, and then in the course of time try to adapt better to the environment, so we get better genes over time. But we also go through a cultural evolution, and that's different from all other animals. We have biology and we have culture. And in the cultural evolution, just as the genes are important for biology, memes are important. Memes are ideas, religions, moral systems, ideologies. And memes, to a large extent, function in precisely the same way as our genes. They're very crucial for who we are. Now, one of the things that we do, one of the strong memes that we carry around with us is the meme of institutionalization. The idea that we have to manage our lives by building institutions. And although other animals also organize their lives, look at the bees, look at the ants, we are the only animals that build great institutions with rules and laws and codes and morality. And in that sense, we are a very unique species. We institutionalize all the satisfaction of our needs. We have a need for food, so we create food industries. And even my dear friends, the chimpanzees, however intelligent they are, never create agrobusiness. And yet they also have a need for food. And they're also, like we, very curious. They have a great need for knowledge, but they don't build universities. We are the only species that, in order to satisfy our needs, built institutions. We built universities. We are in need of health, so we built healthcare institutions. And the interesting thing is that we built institutions in such a way that most of the time they create more space for the chimpanzees than for the bonobos. You see, when we began hunting big game, a good million years ago, we knew immediately that we had to do this cooperatively. Because mind you, we always think of ourselves as the masters of the universe. But for the longest time of our history, we were really very small fellows. We were 1 meter, 20 centimeters. And most of the animals that we wanted to catch were much bigger. So smart as we are, we discovered we had to cooperate. And we cooperated fine and hunting big game. And we did that very well because we had lethal weapons. The interesting thing is that one of the first things, and we often forget, one of the first things we did when we began to walk upright is creating weapons and using stones to throw at other tribes. We are really good. Have you ever realized that we are really good at throwing stones? We are champion stone throwing. There's no other animal that can throw stones as well as we do. So we were very good in catching big animals. But then the trouble started, because since we walk on 2 legs, we didn't have to eat the game where we killed it. We could take the meat with us back home. That's the nice thing about walking upright, that you have your hands free. And just like you go to Superama today, to bring your groceries back home, we walked home with the meat, and then the troubles began. Because then we cooked the meat, And then the question was, how are we going to distribute the meat? Because in any tribe, and it is no different today, you always have the bullies. I think you would probably call them machos here. The guys who always know better and who want to have the biggest portion of meat and who think they have a fundamental right to have more than anyone else. So our early communities, were really under the threat of bullies, because we also discovered that if the bullies get most of the meat, then the others get less. And that's not good, because then they are not fit the next day to go out hunting. A very logical system. So we decided to institutionalize our life in the form of egalitarian societies. And we should never forget that for hundreds of thousands of years, we lived in highly egalitarian societies, in which the bullies were told to hold off and to share. And if they didn't listen to those recommendations, they were just killed. And that kept us alive for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, isn't it remarkable that today we live around the world in highly inegalitarian societies? You don't have to read Thomas Piketty to understand that. And the strange thing is, not only do we live in highly egalitarian societies, the bullies in our times don't get killed. We give them a bonus. They get away with murder. So something went wrong in the process. And the question is, since we adapted so well for reasons of survival as egalitarian societies, we institutionalized equality. Is this a very promising development? Will we be able, as adequately as we have done over the past hundreds of thousands of years, to adapt to modern times and to atrocious times, being highly inegalitarian and just providing the bullies with the first prize? It's interesting to all the time think about the way in which we institutionalize in terms of our survival. Because if you would have asked the good old Charles Darwin, which species stand the best chances of survival, he would have said 4 characteristics are absolutely essential. The species needs to be cooperative. They need to work together. They need to trust each other. They need to be diverse, because the more diverse organisms are, the longer they live. And they need to be highly mobile, open to change, to traveling away, to new places. Now, it seems to me today that we are not meeting any of these Darwinian requirements. Cooperation, across the world, we seem to love competition much better than cooperation. Anything is open for competition. We not only have beauty contests, we have science quizzes, we have music contests, which is the worst that could ever be. Imagine that we're going to give prizes to people who compete in music with other musicians. And music, you don't play against each other, you play with each other. And you achieve much more with competition in music and in other arts than competition gets you nowhere. Cooperation gets you to high places. Trust. Do we still trust each other in the 21st century? Do you trust your leaders? If you look at meetings of the G7 or the G8, you see a couple of people together who in a normal world would either be put in prison or in a lunatic asylum. Do you trust them to run the world? Do you trust lawyers? Do you trust priests? There's very little left of people to be trusted. So in Darwinian terms, we have a real problem. We don't cooperate, we compete, we don't trust anyone. Diversity. Well, we thought in Europe, where I come from, that we were highly multicultural, highly multi-ethnic, really open, really diverse, until the refugees from Syria came. And suddenly we are back to good old-fashioned egoism and nationalism. And we don't think diversity is such a good idea. We'd rather be with our own, people who speak our language, who have our religion. And mobility, well, mobility means that we're open to change. And it seems to me around the world that we are very resistant to change. We would rather be the same. Change seems to be a challenging and unpleasant prospect for many people. So much for survival. And that raises the question, don't we exaggerate in today's times our drive to survive? Are we really, in the atrocities of our times, still willing to survive? It seems to me that one of the characteristics of our species is also that we are the first species in the history of the planet that does its utmost best to extinguish itself as soon as possible. We work so hard in extinguishing this species. We do almost anything that helps us to get rid of ourselves. Now, mind you, I guess we can't ask them, but I guess that most of the other animals on the planet will be very happy once we are gone. I think they throw a big party and will say, good riddance of the humans. They should have gone much earlier. But why would we do so much of our best to totally destroy our environment if we don't have to go yet? We will go, yes, we will disappear. And I must admit, I find that a very comforting thought, that at some point in time, we won't be here any longer. But why hasten the process? We still have a lot of time to go. But do we use that time? Well, let's look for a moment at how we institutionalize two of the most important processes in our societies: education and healthcare. How do we build educational institutions, universities? And how do we build healthcare institutions, hospitals? If you look at it, then it seems to me that the way in which we do that, and the way in which we organize today a university, or the way in which we organize a hospital, is very much guided by the principles of McDonald's. You know, the McDonald's fast food industry and chain is based on 4 very clear business principles that has made that chain enormously successful around the world. I heard once the chief executive officer of McDonald's explain that. He says it's very easy. You build a business on the basis of efficiency, predictability, calculation, and rationalization. And lo and behold, that may be very successful for selling hamburgers, but we transported that model also to our universities and our hospitals. Most of our universities today are built on the principle of efficiency. Oh yes, we tell our students, we love you dearly, but don't hang on too long. Get out as quickly as possible. We don't want you to stay too long. And the same thing actually we do in hospitals, in our healthcare institutions. We tell the patients, don't hang on too long. Leave the hospital, that's efficiency. And whether you leave it horizontally or vertically, we don't really care, as long as you leave. Predictability, everything has to be the same. McDonald's says our French fries have to be the same in Brussels as in Moscow, as in Ouagadougou. Now, this also seems to be true of universities. We spent a lot of time to homogenize the way in which we teach. We spent a lot of time filling out forms to make absolutely sure that you don't do anything different from what the standard is. And the same, of course, in hospitals. Work by the rules. Don't follow your intuition. Calculation, of course. You should get the biggest Mac for the lowest price. Well, that's what we do at universities. If your study happens to be too expensive, or there's not enough interest, then we just delete it. It may be intellectually and culturally tremendously essential to have that study, but we don't care. And if you're ill, you come into the hospital, and you can only be cured by a medication that's too expensive for the insurance company, we'll ask you kindly to die, my dear, and don't hang on, because you're too expensive. Rationalization, of course, increasingly. We are replacing, across the world, human beings with humanoid robots. I always, when I was teaching in your class, Beatrice, I always think it's so strange, it's so medieval that I would still stand there as a human being and talk to other human beings, and that we sort of have an exchange. I mean, that's really no longer of the 21st century. And I'll probably be quickly replaced in the years to come by a talking robot. That's much more efficient, much more cheap. It's rationalization. We do it in hospitals nowadays. Most of the complicated surgery is no longer done by human beings. We have it done by robotics. And much of the care is provided by robots and no longer by human beings. So the question is, what does this all amount to? This amount to what I would call the protocolization of institutions. We live by protocols. We no longer live by experience. In our universities, the good teacher is no longer the experienced man and woman who's been teaching almost all his or her life and who's really inspiring. No, the one who is the good teacher is the one who knows how to fill out all the forms. Is the one who knows how to follow all the protocols that monitor what you do, that assess what you do, that provide a rational justification of what you're doing, not an intellectual justification. Who cares? And the same happens in hospitals. The hospital where I often walk, I see that some of the best surgeons used to be the men and women with a lot of experience. But experience no longer matters. It matters whether you base yourself on the protocol of practices, following the protocol. I'm in the operation chamber and there's two anesthesiologists, an older one and a young one. And the young one says, if we don't intervene now, the patient is going to die. She needs more oxygen. And the older one says, but that would be against the protocol. And the patient dies. And afterwards, I asked the older man, who should have been the more experienced one. But he explains to me, experience does not matter any longer. I have to follow the protocol. And yes, unfortunately, she died. But at least I have the blessing of having followed the protocol. So increasingly, we create protocol institutions. And I think that you could make the argument that in protocol type institutions, where the protocol is sacrosanct and not the human experience, there is too much space for the chimpanzees and not enough space for the loving bonobos. So you begin to wonder whether at this point in time, our institutions don't need the example of the jazz band. And indeed, around the world, there's many people who give master classes and who give courses to explain that the best way in which to organize an institution is to use the jazz band as an example. I'm playing in a jazz band myself, and having done that most of my life, I think it's a very tempting argument. Because the jazz band is a real egalitarian institution. It's a flat organization in which the leadership alternates. If I play a solo, I'm the boss. And then someone else takes over, and she is the boss. So we alternate leadership. We don't have a hierarchical system. And we cooperate with each other. Otherwise, it sounds like nothing. And we trust each other. Only with trust can you play together in a jazz band. The track you just heard was from the latest CD that my band made. And we could only do this, what we did, because we totally trusted upon each other. And we trusted also upon the fact that we had a minimal set of rules. We had a very minimal kind of agreement as to how we would do this song, and a maximum amount of personal freedom, personal autonomy. And yes, we created a sort of order, but then order in jazz music is always followed by disorder and dissolves and disorder in chaos. And then the chaos itself restores itself to order. So all these elements are missing in the protocol type organization. So in that way, we can learn from the organization of a jazz band to institutionalize in a different way. And then, yes, of course, we improvise. And that leads quite a number of people to say these days that our organizations should be improvising organizations. We can solve some of these problems that I've talked about by improvisation. And of course, we've talked a lot about improvisation during this colloquium. But I'd like to make a number of footnotes at the notion of improvisation, however important it is. And I certainly would agree with those who say it's important for modern times institutions to have the freedom to improvise as an adaptive response to changing environments. But a number of footnotes. Lee Konitz, a very famous alto player in the jazz music, once said, improvisation takes place at 4 levels. You have the level of interpretation, the level of variation, the level of embellishment, and the level of transformation. On the first level, you take a melody, you take a structure, and you interpret it in your own way. You give different emphasis. You use the different dynamics that you like at the moment when you play it. Secondly, variation, you take an existing melody and you play around a little bit with it in your own way. You add notes, you subtract notes, form of improvisation. And the third form is embellishment. You have the courage to take a beautiful melody and you have the guts to think you can make it more beautiful. Usually a mistake. Some of the melodies that are being used in jazz music are so beautiful that I would really wish jazz musicians not to touch them. They usually ruin them. But you know, if you are courageous enough And that's the nice thing also about jazz music. You are open to take risks because you may make errors. I try to embellish on a beautiful melody and it doesn't work. I make mistakes. No one will punish you for that in jazz music. We will say, hey, that was wrong. Do it better next time. As Samuel Beckett once said, did you ever fail? Yes. Do you fail again? Yes. Well, fail better. That's the motto for jazz music. Always try to fail better. Make errors, but do them in a better way. And then, of course, we have the last degree of improvisation, that's transformation. And often what you hear is transformation. You take sort of like a given a melodic phrase or whatever it is, and you totally transform it. You bring totally different melodies, totally different chord schemes even. But that's only one part of improvisation. And often when we talk about improvisation, we think about this last level. But sometimes it is much better to just interpret something in your own way. One of the most beautiful jazz recordings is the trumpet player Chet Baker playing one of these wonderful jazz standards. It never entered my mind. And he hardly does anything to it. He doesn't transform that melody. He respects the composer. He plays a little note around this, but he basically leaves it intact. Beautiful jazz music, beautiful improvisation. So we always have to look at what level of improvisation can we use best. Sometimes an organization is not served well with a total transformation. Sometimes it's served better by just a variation on an existing theme. Secondly, aren't we all improvisers? Is improvisation such a special thing? I don't believe, since I'm sitting in a car in Mexico City, driving through the city, I'm absolutely impressed with the fact that all the guys and girls sitting in cars here are masters in improvisation. It's incredible how they do this. The creativity with which they avoid bumping into each other. I see far more cars in Mexico City and far less accidents than in Amsterdam. We don't improvise as well. So the car drivers in Mexico City are beautiful improvisers. And how about cooks in good restaurants? Or when you're cooking yourself, aren't you improvising? Or the single mother, isn't she some of the most beautiful improvisers in the world? Or the psychotherapist, there are no rules for the next question you ask your patient. You have to improvise all the time. Now, here is a really interesting issue, I think. So we improvise. It's not just something special for jazz musicians. We do it all the time. And yet, the characteristics of improvisation we really don't like. Because improvisation implies uncertainty. And if there's one thing that most human beings really dislike, is uncertainty. You have this whole industry of forecasters.